Hello and welcome to another edition of the book review here at CCXP Exam Simulator. This is Michael Bartlett and today I'm going to be reviewing the book Decoding the Why, How Behavioral Science is Driving the Next Generation of Product Design by Nate Andorsky. Now, before I get started, I just want to give a very special thank you to the author Nate. He corresponded with me a little bit on LinkedIn, and I was very curious about his book, and he sent me a copy prior to the release. So I've had a chance to absorb the book and give my thoughts and actually get this review out before the book's even released. So, he didn't know who I was. So that was a really kind thing to do. So I just want to say thank you, Nate, for doing that, and also for trusting me with your material. Okay, so without further ado, let's get stuck into the top takeaways from this book. So my book notes are as follows. So the first point he makes is leverage the power of identity. Now, if you're familiar with the book Start at the End, one of the things that the author, Matt Welliart, says at the end when he's sort of trying to summarize the most important points for behavioral science and interventions is identity is huge. Like if you want someone to change what they're doing, change their behavior, identity is key. What I thought was really interesting is in the beginning of the book, Nate gives a very good example about a insurance company. And the insurance company is trying to find ways to make sure that people are submitting claims that are genuine claims. They're not obviously fraudulent. Well, how do you do that? How can you be able to do that with confidence and know that your interventions worked? And one of the things that he mentioned in the case study was that they changed the game, as they like to say. They changed it from a game of 2 to a game of 3. So rather than being a consumer interacting with their insurance company, it became a consumer interacting with a charity and with their insurance company. And essentially, if I remember correctly, what they did is the company asked consumers to, when they signed up, to mention what their favorite charity was. And they basically said that once they've paid all the claims out for each month, if there's surplus remaining, then they would go ahead and split that between the different charities. And so the reason that it was such a successful intervention is because they changed it from dealing with just an insurance company to kind of mixing that identity with a charity as well. And it's like, well, do you want to, if you're going to screw your insurance company over, now you're screwing over your charity as well. No one wants to do that. And it also fits a little bit into the identity of the individual as well. Are you the kind of person that would screw a charity over or not? So it's again, it's a very, very powerful way to run behavioral interventions. Another great point Nate makes in the book is that you can make behavioral change happen by changing the context, the environment, the norms, the rules. So think of it this way. Rather than looking at a specific person and saying, how can I make them do something? What you should be doing is really looking at the environment, the context, maybe the rules that have been set up, and saying, what can I tweak about these to make them behave differently? So I saw a really good example just the other day because of this whole COVID mess that exploded recently. And someone was like, well, how do you make sure that people wash their hands when they leave the restroom? And what was really cool is they actually put 2 door handles up. And one of them had a little sign that said clean hands. And then the other one had a little sign that said dirty hands. And then on that silver sign, there was little diagrams and, graphics of bacteria all over it in black. And of course, it psychologically makes someone think, well, I don't want to touch the bottom one, I only want to touch the top one, and therefore it motivates them to clean their hands. Obviously, it's reminding them that they need to do it. So I thought that was a great example, and there's plenty out there that are just like that. But that's really essentially what this is all about. You can have someone in situation A behave one way, and then you can just make a little tweak to sit and call it situation B, and it looks almost the same for all intents and purposes, but there's been one little tweak and suddenly you get a completely different behavior change. So that's a very important point to remember. He says, close the gap between current selves and future selves. We think of our future selves as strangers. Anybody who's familiar with behavioral economics probably knows about hyperbolic discounting. But what I really liked is that he dedicates a few chapters to this, and really, because when we come to product design, this is a really big point. How do we encourage people to do things that are going to benefit them in the future? And so he talks about when you think about pain or pleasure, both of those things happening in the future are discounted in the mind. He says not every behavior can be incentivized. That's a good point, actually, because I think sometimes people see certain behaviors and they think, well, there's got to be a way that we can incentivize this. And I like how he's just brutal and blunt with this. Hey, not every behavior can be incentivized. You've got to pick the right ones. And so at the end of the book, he kind of has his own little framework, which I really like. And he says, you gather say data. So say data would be what the people are telling you. And then the do data is the actual behaviors that they exhibit. And so what he's doing is says if you can find patterns and matches between the say and do data, that will hopefully lead you to some behavioral drivers behind either why they're doing something or why they're not doing something. And then from there, you can look at the academic literature and try and figure out if there's any existing solutions that might work, and then you might want to try out some interventions of your own. Now, when you come to the interventions part, this is where I recommend that other book, Start at the End, because his strategy for not only coming up with interventions, but trying different variations of them in small, different experimental areas actually works really well as well. So I think combining these techniques initially with those later in the other book, I think will work really well. This was brilliant. This was my favorite takeaway from the book. Reward inputs rather than outputs. The example he gives is in Weight Watchers. And he says, think about it this way. If the goal is to lose weight, then obviously the person will be motivated, and let's say, they start their journey, and like most people on a diet, they start losing weight quite quickly. Then let's say they hit a plateau, or maybe they even go back up a little bit, which sometimes happens. That can be so demotivating if that's all you're focusing on. It might actually cause somebody to actually stop being on the program. So what Nate's suggesting is look at the inputs instead. So basically, if the inputs are the things that should achieve the outputs, just focus on them. So I think Weight Watchers said what we're going to do is just focus on number of exercises that you do, and reward them for those with points for those instead of the actual weight lost. And that way, even if the weight fluctuates, you're still rewarding the right things, and that way people will be incentivized to continue. He talks a lot about incentivization in his book, and he actually goes on to say, as a kind of a rule of thumb, if there's an activity that people don't really have much interest in, that's where you might want to leverage external rewards initially. And then once you've got them interested, then start trying to trigger intrinsic motivations to reinforce the actions long term. It's so great to see an author talking about self-determination theory. He talks about a lot of really cool things that I like as well. He even brings up the hero's journey in his storytelling chapters as well. It's always really nice when I see someone talk about that, because obviously I had some time in the film business before, so I'm familiar with that structure, and I see it in a lot of storytelling books. But I like this rule of thumb, and I think this is a good way to think about where you can combine an intervention that starts maybe with external rewards and then moves on to intrinsic motivations. He talks about the idea of commitment devices to close the intention-action gap. And actually, funnily enough, this relates to the last point I just made. So back in 2001, I was just a regular guy who was working at a space agency, and I had an interest in the film business. So all my life, I'd been a computer guy, went to college, studied computers, AI. The space agency was just more of the same. It was just programming, basically, I was doing there. But I'd always had this passion to make films. And so I had the intention, right? So how did I bridge the intention-action gap? Well, I did exactly what he's advocating for in this book. I created a commitment device. My commitment device was I created a blog, and it became a very visible blog between 2001 and 2007. 2007 is when I achieved my goal. But basically, it held me accountable. I couldn't just quit because everybody was watching, and there were lots of people that came to the blog, and it had a very high viewership rate. So basically, it made it harder for me to break away from the action. So I had to keep that. I'll close that intention action gap, and that's how I did it. And he talks about commitment devices and making sure that you've got some kind of a reward at the end and someone to hold you accountable. Very interesting chapter, and again very relevant to product design. He says a great way to increase trust is to exploit the similarity bias and the mind's tendency to fill in blanks. So let's think about an example he uses in the book, which is Airbnb. And he says, how do you motivate somebody to rent their house out to a complete stranger? And so then he goes in to talk about some of the psychology between what makes us like somebody and not like somebody. And the more similar someone is to us, the more likely we are to like them. Now think about it this way. It's not just, like I'm a brown English guy, so if someone else is a brown English guy, I'm going to automatically like them more. It goes on dimensions as well. So it could be, I like chess and I meet somebody else that likes chess. I like behavioral economics. I meet someone else that likes behavioral economics. So it's just areas where there's something in common, and that immediately increases trust. And what was really interesting is, once you just get a few of those little nuggets, your mind will almost fill in the blanks. So your mind will automatically assume good things about people just because you've already found a few other good things that match. So that was how Airbnb solved the problem. And another little nugget was they used they did a little nudge where they restricted the character limits and also prompted people on what to say in their bios. So that way, when they shared information about themselves with the owner of the home, it was just enough to be intriguing and make them seem nice, but obviously not too much information where, it would be overshare. And a good way to think about this is just think about a date. If you're going on a date, you don't overshare on the first date, but you give enough information so that hopefully the person, there's a good connection, they trust you, and then you move to a second date. So very, very kind of straightforward idea. He says use something called rubberbanding in gamification. I really like this idea as well if you are intending to gamify any part of your product suite. Rubber banding simply means that when something is too difficult, you make it easier in real time. And when something is too easy, you make it slightly more challenging in real time. And the reason for this is because if something is too easy, people just get bored. And if something is too hard, people just get frustrated and give up. So you want to try and find that sweet spot in the middle where it's just challenging enough that it makes it worth their while to keep going. This ties into something else that I've mentioned in one of my other book reviews. If you look up the book review for Alive at Work, they talk about a part of the brain known as the seeking system, and that directly is relevant to that point. And finally, he talks about something called regulatory mode theory. Like I said, I'm very familiar with behavioral economics and decision making and motivation, so this was brand new to me, and I always love it when I pick up a book and I see new things that I've not seen before. So I've left an article, a link to the Wikipedia article here, but we're going to go and look at that on the next slide. But essentially it talks about two different ways to realize goals: assessment, where you want to research all your options, and locomotion, where you just want action and movement. So here's what the Wikipedia article says. Regulatory mode theory, it says it was developed by folks who were interested in the development of goal pursuit as well as motivation. The theory depicts two main approaches to situations using locomotion and assessment. So the regulatory mode theory depicts how people approach situations to achieve the goal. People are geared towards the locomotion mode, are focused on getting things done and moving things along. So in contrast, those that are strong in assessment will compare different goals and analyze different options. Now, in the book, he actually shows a study where people took these two ideas and ran marketing campaigns with them both in mind. And with this theory, it proved to be correct and actually did see a change. And this reminds me a lot of some of the work that's been done with the Big Five, if any of you are familiar with that. In terms of personality traits, they've done studies where you can actually target people based on their big five profiles, assuming you've got enough information to know what that is, and they found like, you know, certain ads will resonate much more with, say, someone who's an extrovert than an introvert. Also, some ads will really, you know, disgust people and put people off who are one kind of extreme than another. And the big five is five different tensions, if you will, with extremes on either end, like introvert and extrovert. So if you've not heard about that before, I recommend looking that up. But essentially, in a nutshell, this is the book Decoding the Why. And I think Nate's done a really, really great job, and I fully recommend this to you if you are either a product developer or someone that is involved with designing products, designing user interfaces. So I hope that was useful. If you've got any more books you would like to see reviewed, just hit me up on LinkedIn or drop me a message to the email below. And just in case you're not familiar with me, I run a CCXP training company, which is Certified Customer Experience Professional. So if you're looking to get certified in that area or learn more about customer experience, just go ahead and contact me and I can help you. All right, until next time, guys, take care. Bye-bye.